views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
On this week's Today's Verdict, we have a very big show for you today. First up, we're going to have State Senator Luis Sepúlveda on. He's going to discuss his new bill that will be limiting liability with respect to nursing homes during the COVID pandemic. Certainly a lot of controversy there, but he'll be on, and we want to hear what he has to say. Next up, we have a well-respected, well-known criminal defense attorney in New Jersey. Warren Sutnick will be here to talk to you a little about the difference between New York, New Jersey law during the pandemic, and talk a little bit about specific laws that you've been asking to discuss, including DWI and marijuana. And finally, we have joining us Marrisa Senteno. Marrisa is the co-director at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She's going to be talking about expanding a new law, basically, that will be giving more rights to domestic workers who've been severely impacted during the pandemic. So as you can see, we have a lot to get to. Stay tuned. Today's Verdict starts right now. Returning to our show, Senator Luis Sepúlveda. First of all, Senator, how are you doing today?
You know, every day since the beginning of this COVID crisis has been difficult for us here. My staff has been dedicated to helping the community on a constant basis. I mean, people need so much help. Right now, we're dealing with issues of food insecurity and distribution of PPEs and gearing up for potential issues with evictions. You know, my district had a lot of evictions prior to COVID, so we're worried about people being removed from their apartments. We are anticipating a lot of pain and suffering come fall. I'm not happy that yet with, or not content yet with the school reopening program.
Wow, yeah.
I'm concerned about the over 100,000 kids that have been infected with COVID throughout the country, and some of the misinformation coming from the administration. So, the thing is that we have a lot of work to do. My staff is working real diligently to help people in our community because everyone is going to need help.
Well, you were one of our first guests on, really, once COVID hit, and weathering the storm, which is obviously still upon us, has not been very easy. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about a new bill, which I think is very important. It's a bill that limits malpractice immunity with respect to nursing homes. And I want to maybe take a step back first, if you could, State Senator, so the viewers can understand what transpired with respect to the nursing homes as COVID hit. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. So as part of the budget, the governor essentially requested that we give blanket immunity to healthcare facilities in lieu of a lot of the lack of knowledge that we had regarding the virus and how people were infected, how it spread. There was a lot of information that we didn't have about how this virus reacts, and certainly the lackluster, at best, response of the federal government. So with all this information that we didn't have, we had to be able to create an environment where healthcare facilities were still willing to treat patients during this crisis. We were very concerned that the facilities would just shut down or not allow either more nursing home patients or patients into healthcare facilities, because it wasn't just nursing homes that received this blanket immunity. It was healthcare facilities, basically, under Article 28 of the Public Health Law, 16 and 31 under the Mental Hygiene Law. So in order for them to continue to function, we have to afford them a certain level of blanket immunity during this crisis.
Now, is it just for COVID cases, or is it for any kind of cases that come in that even may be related to COVID cases?
Well, prior to the passing of my bill in August, actually July, late July, which essentially rolled back some of these complete blanket immunity, it was related to almost anything in a nursing home. So if a patient fell, suffered an injury, during that period when we granted a blanket immunity, then families could not suffer, cannot sue the facilities because of any lack of care. Yeah. The only way that you can sue a facility is that if you demonstrated either complete gross negligence or intentional criminal liability,
which is a very high threshold to meet.
It's extremely high threshold to overcome, but certainly under the crisis, you could see why we did it. But I believe now that we have a lot more information about COVID, we're better prepared to understand the way the virus operates and the limitations that healthcare facilities had. Now I don't see a need, or I didn't see a need prospectively for us to give this blanket immunity to healthcare facilities.
Was there pushback from, let's say the New York State trial lawyers? Was there pushback from the community that wanted to still hold some of the facilities accountable? Where did you feel the pressure also in terms of maybe making a concession if you needed to with respect to parts of the bill?
Well, you had pushback by the healthcare facilities, by the healthcare associations. Certainly, there was some pushback. I believe their biggest concern, although they're not happy with my amendment to the Emergency Disaster Treatment Protection Act, they were essentially freaking out about the possibility of removing the blanket immunity retroactively.
Retroactively, sure.
Right, because a lot of these facilities operated on the basis that they had this level of blanket immunity. And so now to take it away from them, and that was one of the reasons why I sponsored the bill, was because these facilities operated on a certain basis, right? Myself as an attorney, a practicing attorney, and a person who appreciates constitutional history, I thought it was unfair to essentially pull the rug out of these facilities when we gave them the immunity. But I thought it was completely fair to remove the immunity prospectively.
Sure.
And that's where we are now. Now, the original sponsor of the bill was another Bronx Assembly person, Alexander Biaggi.
Yeah.
But she felt that the removal of the immunity should be retroactive to essentially March 7th, which is the emergency executive orders by the governor. I have a lot of respect for Senator Biaggi, but
she's a friend of the show. She's been on as well. I mean, listen,
right.
it's not always good to agree.
Right. You can't tell facilities, this is the law, operate under this premise, and then say, we shouldn't have given you that because it's just unfair to the facilities. And I mean, unfortunately, it's unfair to the families. But under the crisis, sometimes we have to take actions that are necessary in order to essentially maintain the standard of healthcare that we needed in the state of New York, not just here in the city, but throughout the state of New York.
All right, Senator, let's shift gears for a second. There's a lot of great stuff that you've been doing for the district. Tell the viewers a little about the Grub Hub and the what's been going on there. I love it.
Yeah, so there's it's called Rescuing Leftover Cuisine with Grub Hub. So this is an organization that feeds individuals. Essentially, they take foods from restaurants and they distribute it throughout the city. So we were able to negotiate and facilitate and secure for the next 35 weeks at Melrose houses that these organizations, Grub Hub with Rescue, will provide cooked meals for people that live in that community, in that housing development. But also anybody, I mean, if you're walking in the street in the neighborhood and you're hungry, we're going to give you food. So this is something where my staff and I are very proud of, because there's a lot of food insecurity in these areas, and to be able to provide them with a home cooked meal.
Yeah,
and
so important.
I personally saw how important it is. People were actually eating right there; they were hungry.
Speaking of which, just homelessness and some lawlessness. What are your feelings in the district? Has there been an uptick? I know it's all over the news. New York City itself falling into some horrible situation with respect to lawlessness. Personally, I don't see it. Tell me what you have experienced.
Sure. Well, David, there's been a since the beginning of this session, where actually, let's take it back a little further. Myself and several senators, the leader of the Senate created a working group to reform some of our criminal justice laws, and certainly bail, parole, all that issue that was a big concern, because a couple of weeks after the bill became law and became effective, you had an intense amount of fear mongering going on in our communities. Everything, if a particular suspect had been released 38 times prior to the reforms, but because they committed an offense that was not bail eligible, they were blaming it all on bail reform. Yeah. And ultimately, the police commission, which I think has done a disservice to the city of New York with its fear mongering, had to eat some of his words when some of the data established that bail reform had nothing to do with what was happening then. Crime was ticking up beginning March, even before all this started. And if you look at, for example, in where Mr. Brown suffered a death at the hands of police, in that area, you'll see that there was an uptick in crime. And in a lot of areas where you have this political unrest, there's an uptick in crime. But ultimately, as it happened there, it subsided and things went back to normal. And I believe that's what's going to happen here in New York State. All the reforms that we've done, if you look at the data that came after this, it was successful. People that were no longer being held in a jail cell could maintain their jobs and maintain their families. And generally speaking, it was successful. Now the issue is police reform. The big issue now is 58.
We could spend weeks on that, but unfortunately we're out of time. But listen, State Senator, we're going to have you back. You're a friend to the show. We always like checking in. Stay safe. All right.
Thank you so much, David. Always great to be on your show anytime you want to have me. And thank you, Yesenia, for a great job you do.
My pleasure. All right, we'll be back with some more Today's Verdict. Stay with us right after this.
Be well.
With Marrisa Senteno of the New York co-director of National Domestic Workers Alliance. First of all, Marrisa, thanks for being here today. How are you doing through this whole COVID pandemic?
We take it. Thank you for having me, and we literally take it one day at a time. This pandemic has been both an economic health crisis for domestic workers across New York State, and in particular New York City. So we take it one day at a time here. Thank you for having me.
I want to talk about the Domestic Workers Bill rights, the act that was passed into law in 2010. Tell us a little bit about that particular act and what you're proposing now, or your organization is proposing, in terms of amending that legislation.
So just a bit of a historical context. Domestic workers are largely women of color. Currently, they make up a large proportion of immigrant women of color who do domestic work, which is nannying, caregiving, and house cleaning. And so the National Domestic Workers Alliance is a national organization that organizes over 2 million domestic workers across the country. In New York State, we have approximately 200,000 domestic workers alone. And prior to 2010, domestic workers fell in this subset of labor population that had been historically excluded from labor protections and labor laws. And that's because during the New Deal, a time in our country's history when we were actually creating the framework for labor rights across the country, there were certain sectors that were specifically left out. And that is because they are the sectors that Black men and women worked. And so those would be agriculture, the service-based industry, and domestic work. So you fast forward to around the 2000s, and we realize domestic workers actually aren't privy to most of the basic labor standards that most other laborers have. And this is because of institutionalized racism, right? It is a holdover. So in 2010, it was the very first state in the entire country to pass a basic Bill of Rights for domestic workers. And that was to actually keep domestic workers, bring them into the current day and age, which was to give them basic labor standards like overtime, protection against sexual harassment, the ability to take a day off, some of the most basic things that other people in the country and the state had.
So the viewers can know that's a trombone in the background. Am I correct?
I apologize. This is what quarantine.
That's okay. Which, by the way, I have a 10-year-old, so I get it. And with COVID, you end up really you end up being more than just a parent. You end up becoming a teacher, and you become a healthcare worker and everything else. So we completely understand that here at today's verdict, that it's nice to see that there's some musical instrument in the background, at least we're working on. Getting back. You know,
what I would like to add is that for the human rights law in New York City, we want to make sure that all domestic workers are able to go to work in a safe and respectful workplace. And currently they are subject to discrimination of all sorts. You could be discriminated against in the workplace as a domestic worker because of the color of your skin, because of your religion, because of your age, right? And what employers don't necessarily understand is that these are holdovers from some pretty systemic racism. And we want to make sure that employers understand there is a framework under which how to treat domestic workers. And the effects are extremely damaging to women of color, in particular Black women who are domestic workers. Last week, we noted the Black Women's Equal Pay Day. And part of bringing Black women up to parity and other women of color up to parity to equity within this country is understanding how our laws affect wages. So that when a woman is discriminated against in the workplace because of the color of her skin, she has to go to the next job and start from zero. And then she has to understand that there isn't an accumulation of wealth over time in terms of your salary. And so during this pandemic, New York City actually deemed COVID as a disability under which there are accommodations for. Domestic workers are essential workers. They're the child care workers, they're the nannies and the home caregivers that have continued to work throughout this pandemic in close proximity. You cannot socially distance and do domestic work. It is not compatible. And so what happens is that they are deemed essential workers without the essential labor protections to keep this industry thriving and growing. And so we are in like a perfect storm at this moment of a health crisis during the pandemic, of institutionalized racism, and of an economic recession that has hit domestic workers very hard. So the New York City Council can actually create history right now by passing a Human Rights Inclusion Intro 339 and actually set the stage for the rest of the state and the country to show what it means to actually bring domestic workers, Black women, and other women of color up to parity to the rest of our country.
Is there support for the expansion?
Absolutely. I think what had happened was that during the COVID pandemic, everything sort of went into turmoil. And then what we were seeing was that due to the effects of the pandemic, that these laws could actually be could help mitigate some of the damage done. And there is support. We have an overwhelming majority for City Council, and we have support from our mayor, and we have support from the Commission on Human Rights. So we're happy to that.
Well, we're gonna have to leave it there, Marrisa. I know you got a lot on your hands back there.
Sure.
Some musical instruments and a lot of other stuff. Good luck with expanding it. It's an important thing that hopefully our viewers will get behind. And we'd like you on in a couple of weeks. Maybe you can tell us what the results were. Okay.
Yes, we would love to tell you when we win.
Wonderful. I love it. All right. Stay with
And
us.
you can reach us at domesticworkers.org, and you can get involved. We would love that. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. All right, we'll be back with more Today's Verdict. Stay with us right after this. We're here with Warren Sutnick of Sutnick and Sutnick. First of all, Warren, thanks very much for being here today. How are you doing today?
Yeah, so we're doing okay. I mean, everyone I know is having a difficult time during the pandemic. Certainly, law firms are included in that, but overall, we're doing well. Doing well.
Well, what was it like in New Jersey initially after COVID hit in terms of the criminal law system? What were your reactions, your feelings about it?
Right. So I would think it's very similar to what happened in New York. Obviously, our states were hit very early on and hit very hard. It was very drastic what happened. The criminal justice system and the court system virtually shut down immediately within a matter of days. What was particularly distressing for us who practice in criminal law is that people's lives are at stake. And what I mean by that is that their rights are being infringed in some ways because they have a right to a speedy trial, they have a right to confront witnesses. All of that has really been put on hold now for about 4 months. And that's distressing for our clients and for their families as well. So it has been difficult for our clients.
Well, let's get into that. Let's talk a little bit about jury trials. Certainly in the civil system on my side here, there's really no jury trials at all. Maybe a bench trial here and there, but it's basically shut down. What's the situation in New Jersey with respect to jury trials right now?
Right. So that's an excellent question. So what I always say to people always ask me about being a criminal defense attorney. And I take that very seriously because, to me, it is the only legal profession that is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. And I don't want to be hokey about it or corny about it, but the Constitution specifically says when somebody is charged with a crime, they have a right to an attorney. And I take that responsibility incredibly seriously. And the reason that it is so important is that when you are accused of a crime in our system, you have a right to have a trial and you have a right to have a speedy trial. Now, whatever a speedy trial is, sometimes is subject to interpretation. But what is very important, is that the state wants to take away a person's liberty. They want to imprison a person. It's not about money. This is not about damages. This is not about somebody trying to recover. This is about a person's liberty being taken away. And when you take away, and I'm not saying it's unintentionally, it's not. We are in a health crisis. But when you take away a person's right to a speedy trial, you are essentially taking away a constitutional right. And unfortunately, that is what is occurring here in New Jersey and in New York as well. Because all jury trials have been suspended, basically, we have clients, there are inmates across this region who are sitting in jail with no light at the end of the tunnel of when they're going to have their opportunity to have a trial.
Which leads me to the issue of COVID in the jails. What is the situation? It was not doing so well in New York for a while. What's it like in New Jersey with respect to the spread of the virus in the prisons?
Right. So it's been really incredibly upsetting what's happening out here. And again, it's happened in New York as well. As I said, our region was hit early and hit particularly hard. In New Jersey, we've had dozens of inmates die in the prison system. I think at last count, 38 inmates have passed away. There are people in the prison system, just like general population, who have pre-existing health conditions, whether it's diabetes or something else, and they have been particularly affected. And it's not only the inmates. It is the employees that work there as well. There have been over 250 diagnosed cases of either inmates or employees in the prison system of COVID. And so not only are you affecting the inmates, not only are you affecting the employees, but you're affecting possibly the employees' families who are leaving to go home from work every day, just like all of us.
So Warren, let me ask you a question, because in New York, there's been a hint of some lawlessness that's been occurring. Whether you can say that's because the police aren't really doing what they normally would be doing, or just the way the times have been unfolding. In New Jersey, obviously, we're not getting jury trials. We're not getting a tremendous amount of help from the criminal justice system. Does there seem to be an uptick in any type of crime, lawlessness in your neck of the woods?
No, in fact, I would say really it's been almost quite the opposite. I do think some of the uptick in violent crime that has occurred is probably because there's a lot of pent-up frustration. You have people that were virtually locked in their homes for several months. And unfortunately, when that happens, it's very stressful in people's lives. And now that the weather obviously had become warm, it was summertime, people were outside, I think it did naturally evolve into some uptick in violent behavior. But I would not say that it's been the same as we've seen, at least in the media, in New York.
New York.
You know.
And one more, marijuana sale, marijuana possession. I get that all the time. New Jersey, New York, hit me.
Okay, New Yorkers are shocked when they come into New Jersey and suddenly they are arrested. If they're possessing marijuana, they are handcuffed. It is a misdemeanor. Over 50 grams is a felony. They are shocked that New Jersey is still enforcing marijuana as strictly as they can. And I'm going to tell you something that's really interesting.
Yeah.
For about a year and a half, New Jersey has struggled with attempting to legalize adult use marijuana. And when I say struggled, everybody's basically on the same page. The governor, our legislature, the public's basically on the same page. But how to go about doing that has really been the subject of a lot of controversy. We are actually having a referendum this November about whether or not to legalize adult use marijuana. I sense that that is probably going to pass referendum, and that within a year from now, there will be laws in place that allow small amounts of adult use marijuana. What I also sense is that law enforcement knows it's coming. And because they know it's coming, they are out there enforcing it as strictly as can be. I have had clients who were arrested with having a roach, an old roach in their ashtray for possession of marijuana. So I tell everybody, now more than ever, you might think marijuana is nothing, but now more than ever, you can never have marijuana in a motor vehicle with you. You cannot, because if you're pulled over for anything and the police smell it, you're getting arrested.
Okay, finally, very important. Where do we find you? A lot of people are going to want to reach out.
Great. All right. So again, our firm is Sutnick and Sutnick. My partner is actually my wife. I call her my partner. She would say she's my boss. We've been out here for over 20 years. Both of us started out at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, so we were prosecutors for many years. I was there for 6 years. My wife, Laura, was there for 8 years. We've had our practice here in New Jersey, as I said, for about 20 years. We're located in Hackensack, so we're about 10 minutes over the George Washington Bridge. We're located in Court Plaza, which is at 21 Main Street in Hackensack, right across the street from the Superior Court. And our phone number is 201-342-8555. And of course, you can find us on the internet.
Warren, great stuff. We'll have you back. Stay safe. And really, the viewers are going to reach out, I can tell.
Great, Dave. You too. Take care.
All right. We'll be back with more Today's Verdict. Stay with us right after this. All right. Well, that's all we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us and, of course, you for watching. If you have any future topics that you would like me to discuss on the show, please email me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org. Always remember, please, know your issues, know the law, reach a verdict with us. We'll see you next time in 2 weeks. Take care.